Nobody could believe what was happening. A stray dog had just walked into the courtroom, right in the middle of a serious trial. At first, people chuckled, but then the dog did something strange. It barked exactly 3 times, loud and clear. The judge was about to order the dog removed, when suddenly the entire courtroom fell silent. What happened next left everyone in shock. This is one of the most bizarre and unbelievable moments ever caught in a courtroom. A random stray dog interrupting a trial? That's weird enough. But what if I told you this dog wasn't just barking for no reason? What if those 3 barks actually changed the outcome of the trial? Stay with me, because this story is going to give you chills. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the polished wooden benches. The scent of old paper and polished mahogany filled the room, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. Rain pattered against the tall glass windows, and every few moments, a distant rumble of thunder echoed through the building. It had been months of back-and-forth arguments. Every piece of evidence had been scrutinized, every witness cross-examined, and yet the case seemed to be leading to only one outcome: conviction. The young man at the center of it all, Alex Carter, sat rigid in his chair. His hands were clasped together, his knuckles white. He had repeated the same words over and over again, to his lawyer, to the jury, to himself. I didn't do it. I wasn't there. But the prosecution had built a rock-solid case. Surveillance footage had placed him near the crime scene. A witness swore they had seen him running away. The forensic reports tied his presence to the area. His defense attorney, Mr. Clarkson, had fought valiantly. He pointed out inconsistencies in the testimonies, highlighted the lack of direct physical evidence, and questioned the credibility of the witnesses. But it all seemed to be falling on deaf ears. And now, it was time for the prosecution's final argument. The lead prosecutor, Mr. Hendricks, straightened his tie and stepped forward. He had a reputation for being ruthless, and he wasn't about to let this case slip through his fingers. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice steady, confident. We have shown you, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant, Alex Carter, was present at the scene of the crime. The evidence speaks for itself. The testimonies confirm it, and in just a few moments, you will have the power to bring justice to this case. Alex swallowed hard. He felt his heartbeat pounding in his ears. His mother, sitting in the back row, clutched a crumpled tissue in her hands. She looked at her son with a mixture of fear and desperation, silently praying for a miracle. Then it happened. Just as Mr. Hendricks was about to deliver his closing words, a soft creaking sound echoed through the silent courtroom. At first, nobody noticed. It was subtle, like a whisper in the wind, a slight disturbance in the stillness. Then came another sound, a faint jingle, a rhythmic clinking of metal against metal, like the soft chime of a tiny bell. A few people turned their heads, eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Click, 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 the sound of nails against the cold marble floor. Slow, deliberate steps. Then, a murmur rippled through the audience. Heads turned. A scruffy, golden-brown dog stood at the entrance of the courtroom. Its fur was damp, matted in places, as though it had been wandering in the rain. Its tail hung low, twitching slightly, and its ears perked up at the heavy silence in the room. The dog was neither scared nor aggressive. It simply stood there, observing, as if it knew. A soft gasp escaped from somewhere in the crowd. The judge furrowed his brow, clearly irritated by the unexpected interruption. He motioned for the bailiff to remove the animal, but before anyone could act, the dog did something strange. It walked forward, not in a frantic, lost manner, nor in a nervous shuffle. No, this dog moved with intent, with purpose. It padded past the empty rows of wooden benches, past the court stenographer who had frozen mid-typing, past the jury members who exchanged bewildered glances. Then it stopped, right in front of Alex Carter. And then it barked, once, twice, 3 times. Sharp, clear, deliberate. A heavy silence fell over the room. It wasn't just the bark itself. It was the way the dog had barked, each one spaced evenly, as if signaling something. Alex's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened in disbelief. No way, he whispered, barely audible. His hands trembled as he reached forward, hesitant, almost afraid that what he was seeing wasn't real. The dog took a step closer, its deep brown eyes locking onto his. There was something familiar in that gaze, something known. Then Alex did something that stunned everyone. He dropped to his knees, right there in the middle of the courtroom floor. Max! A collective gasp echoed through the room. The dog's tail wagged, just once, but with recognition. His tongue flicked out briefly, a soft whimper escaping his throat. A few murmurs scattered through the audience. The judge exchanged a confused look with the bailiff, who shrugged. Mr. Hendricks, the prosecutor, cleared his throat loudly. "Your Honor, we cannot allow this." But before he could finish, Alex turned toward the judge, eyes filled with something new. Hope. This is my dog," he said, his voice shaking. "This is Max." The courtroom erupted. Voices overlapped, gasps and whispers filling the space. The judge banged his gavel, calling for silence, but the energy in the room had shifted. Something monumental had just happened, and no one could ignore it, because according to the police report, Max had gone missing on the very night of the crime. And now, after all this time, he had returned. But why here? Why now? The answer would change everything. Nobody knew where the dog had come from. It didn't belong to the court staff, and security swore they had never seen it before. The courtroom had strict entry procedures. Every person who stepped inside was screened. Every item carried in was checked. And yet somehow this scruffy, golden brown dog had wandered in, as if it owned the place. No one had opened the door for it. No one had seen it sneak in. It was as if it had simply appeared. The bailiff, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl, moved toward the dog, ready to shoo it away. "Get on out of here," he muttered, clapping his hands together. But the dog didn't flinch. Instead, it did something unusual. It stood its ground, planted its paws firmly on the polished marble floor, and locked eyes with the defendant, Alex Carter. A hush fell over the room. The murmurs died down, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. Then it barked, once, twice, 3 times. Each bark was sharp, deliberate, and spaced just enough to feel intentional. Not frantic, not fearful, almost as if it was trying to say something. A ripple of whispers ran through the crowd. Some of the jury members leaned forward, exchanging puzzled glances. The judge, a man known for his patience wearing thin, let out a sigh and rubbed his temple. "Someone remove that dog," he ordered, his voice firm. But before the bailiff could take a step forward, something strange happened. Alex Carter, the young man accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit, suddenly stopped breathing for a moment. His face drained of color. His fingers trembled as they clutched the edge of the table. His wide, disbelieving eyes were fixed on the dog, as if he were seeing a ghost. This is my dog," he whispered, barely able to get the words out. His voice cracked, filled with something between shock and raw emotion. "This is Max." The room seemed to inhale all at once. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A woman in the back row covered her mouth with her hands. A man leaned forward, gripping the edge of his seat. Even the judge, who had been moments away from calling security, paused, his eyebrows knitting together. The prosecutor, Mr. Hendricks, scoffed, arms crossed. "That's absurd," he said, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is clearly a distraction." But Alex wasn't listening. He had already risen from his seat, his entire body frozen in disbelief. His mind was racing, because, according to the police report, Max had gone missing on the very night Alex was accused of the crime. Max had disappeared without a trace. The backyard gate had been left open, something Alex had always been careful about. He had searched for him for days, calling his name through the streets, checking shelters, hanging up missing dog posters. But Max was gone, and now, after all this time, he had returned, right here, in this courtroom, at this exact moment. Why? How? The dog took another step forward, his paws making soft tapping sounds against the floor. His tail gave the tiniest wag, not playful, but recognizing. His eyes, deep brown, and filled with something too human to be ignored, locked onto Alex's with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. Then, as if on cue, Max turned his head, slowly, deliberately, and he stared at the prosecutor. Hendricks frowned, shifting in place. "This is ridiculous," he said, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, I move too." But Max did something then that sent another wave of shock through the room. He growled, low, steady, unmistakable. It wasn't the type of growl a dog makes when it's scared or defensive. No, this was something different, something knowing, something pointed. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Get that mutt out of here," he snapped, but there was a new edge to his voice, one that wasn't there before. The bailiff hesitated. The judge narrowed his eyes, his gavel hovering just above the block. Something wasn't right. Even he could feel it. Alex finally took a step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Max," he called, as if saying the name would confirm that this was really happening, that this wasn't some cruel trick his mind was playing on him. Max's ears perked at the sound of his name. He let out a small whimper, the kind a dog makes when it finally finds its owner after being lost for too long. A lump formed in Alex's throat. He reached out, kneeling down slightly, but before his fingers could brush against the dog's fur, Max turned away again, this time toward the jury. He walked past each juror, sniffing briefly, his movements slow, methodical. Then, he stopped in front of one particular woman, a juror with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, who had been skeptical of the prosecution's claims from the start. Max sat down in front of her and let out a soft, single bark. The juror stiffened, her lips parted slightly, as if something had just clicked into place in her mind. Something wasn't adding up. Something had never added up. Then, without warning, Max turned again. This time, he padded straight toward the prosecution's table and stopped, right at the feet of Mr. Hendricks. Silence, thick, heavy. The prosecutor stiffened, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of dozens of eyes watching him. Max didn't growl this time. He didn't bark. He simply sat there, staring up at the man. Seconds passed like hours. Then, for the first time since the trial had started, Mr. Hendricks looked nervous. Alex noticed it first, then the defense attorney, then the judge. Max hadn't come here by accident. He had come for a reason, and in that moment, everyone in the courtroom began to realize this case was far from over. A heavy silence hung in the air. The sound of the ticking courtroom clock seemed louder than ever. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. All eyes were on Max, the scruffy, golden-brown dog who had barged into the courtroom like he belonged there. The very dog that had vanished the night Alex was accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit. Coincidence? Or was there something more? The judge, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, rubbed his temple in frustration. "This is highly irregular," he muttered. He adjusted his robe and glanced at the bailiff. "Get animal control in here immediately." But before anyone could act, Alex's lawyer, Mr. Carter, stood up. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the urgency he felt. "Your Honor," he said firmly, stepping forward, "before you dismiss this, I ask that we take a moment to consider what's happening here." The judge sighed. "Mr. Carter, unless your client's defense involves a stray dog, I don't see how this is relevant to the case." Carter nodded. "I understand how this looks, but this isn't just any stray. This dog, Max, disappeared on the night of the alleged crime. My client has insisted from the beginning that something happened that night, something that could prove his innocence. Now, out of nowhere, this very same dog reappears, right here, in this courtroom." A wave of whispers spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in a navy blue suit, crossed her arms. "Are you implying that this dog has evidence?" she said, half laughing. "What's next? Is he going to take the stand and testify?" Scattered chuckles rippled through the courtroom, but Carter didn't flinch. "I'm implying that this dog might be the key to proving my client didn't commit this crime." His voice was resolute. The judge studied Carter for a long moment. He had seen plenty of bizarre courtroom events over the years, but this was something else entirely. He exhaled slowly. "Fine. You have 10 minutes to explain why this dog matters. But if this is some kind of stunt, Mr. Carter, I won't be amused." Carter nodded. He turned to Alex, who sat frozen, his eyes never leaving Max. "Alex," Carter said gently, "tell the court about the night Max went missing." Alex swallowed hard. He hadn't spoken much during the trial, mostly because no one believed him. But now, with Max sitting right there, tail curled around his paws, eyes locked on him, he finally had a chance. "It was late," Alex began, his voice hoarse. "I had just finished my shift at the diner and was walking Max like I always did." The memory was fresh now, like it had happened yesterday. "We took the same route through the park, but that night something was different." Max was tense. He kept sniffing the air, ears twitching like he heard something I didn't. He paused, taking a shaky breath. Then, out of nowhere, Max took off. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. He bolted down the street, barking like crazy. I ran after him, calling his name, but he wouldn't stop. Then, just as I turned the corner, his voice cracked. The cops showed up. Silence. Carter nodded encouragingly. "Go on. They said I was trespassing, said I matched the description of someone they were looking for." I tried to explain. I told them I was just looking for my dog, but they wouldn't listen. Then they said Max wasn't there. Alex shook his head, voice filled with disbelief. "But he was. I know he was. Then he was just gone." The courtroom was eerily still. Even the judge, who had been skeptical minutes ago, leaned slightly forward. Carter turned to the prosecutor. "You claimed there were no witnesses, correct?" She hesitated. That's right. Then explain this, Carter said, gesturing toward Max, because that dog, he was there. And now, for some reason, he's come back. The prosecutor pursed her lips. And if he was there, Carter continued, then maybe he saw something that night. Something that proves Alex wasn't the one committing that crime. The judge drummed his fingers against the bench, deep in thought. Finally, he spoke. I'll allow a short recess. Let's find out where this dog came from and what this means for the case. Court officers scrambled into action. A vet was called in to check Max for an ID chip. The bailiff checked security footage from outside the courthouse to see how the dog got in. The entire courtroom buzzed with speculation. And then, something shocking happened. One of the officers who had arrested Alex that night walked in, holding a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a collar, a torn, dirty collar, with Max's name on it. The officer looked uneasy as he handed it to the judge. We actually found this near the crime scene, but assumed it belonged to a stray. We never connected it to the case. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Carter grabbed the bag and held it up. This proves Max was there that night. He ran after someone, and Alex wasn't lying. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Do you have any explanation for why this was never introduced as evidence? The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't considered relevant at the time. A tense silence filled the room. Not relevant, Carter repeated, his voice hard. This could prove my client's innocence. The judge's face was unreadable. Then, he turned to the bailiff. Check security footage from the night of the crime. If that dog was there, I want to see it. The room waited in anticipation. As the footage was pulled up, the screen flickered to life. And then, the courtroom collectively gasped. There was Max. But he wasn't alone. A shadowy figure sprinted across the screen. And it wasn't Alex. It was someone else entirely. The real culprit. The air in the courtroom was electric. The prosecutor's face had gone pale. The evidence, the timing, the dog's sudden return, it all fit together. Max, the very dog who had vanished the night of the crime, had just blown the case wide open. The judge took off his glasses and sighed deeply. Then he looked at Alex. Mr. Harris, you're free to go. The courtroom erupted. Alex sat in stunned silence as Max trotted over to him, tail wagging. It was over. He was finally free. And all because his dog refused to let the truth stay buried. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a witness, a hero, the missing piece to a puzzle that had nearly cost Alex his life. For months, Alex had sat in that courtroom, watching the walls close in around him. He had listened as prosecutors painted him as a criminal. He had watched as witnesses hesitated, unsure of what they had seen. He had felt the weight of evidence, circumstantial, flawed, yet damning, pressing down on him. And then, in a moment no one could have predicted, Max walked through those courtroom doors and changed everything. There had been no grand announcement, no sign from the heavens, just the sound of paws on marble and the quiet jingle of a collar. But in that simple moment, the course of Alex's life shifted, because Max was more than just a pet. He was proof. Proof that Alex had told the truth. Proof that the police had missed something, or perhaps ignored it entirely. Proof that justice wasn't always as clear-cut as it seemed. Max had been there that night. He had seen what happened, and while he couldn't speak the language of the court, he had spoken in the only way he knew how, by showing up when it mattered most. Some called it fate, others called it a miracle. The odds of a missing dog appearing in the exact courtroom, at the exact moment his owner needed him, were beyond reason. It was the kind of thing that happened in movies, in books, in stories people whispered about but never truly believed. Yet here Max was. Perhaps he had been wandering the city for months, searching for Alex. Perhaps he had followed a familiar scent, guided by instinct. Or perhaps, in some way no one could explain, he had simply known where he needed to be. Whatever the reason, he had arrived just in time, and it had changed everything. Max didn't just walk into that courtroom. He demanded to be noticed. He hadn't crept in quietly, or waited in the shadows. He had walked straight in, head high, tail firm, eyes locked onto Alex. Then, he had barked, once, twice, 3 times. Some had thought it was random. Just the excited yapping of a stray dog. But looking back, it was clear. Max had been trying to say something. Had he recognized the judge's voice? Had he sensed the tension in the air? The same tension Alex had felt the night of his arrest? Had he known that his best friend was fighting for his life? No one could say for sure. But what they did know was this. Max had spoken in the only way he could. And the courtroom had listened. After the trial, reporters swarmed Alex, desperate for his story. The man who had been accused of a crime he didn't commit. The dog who had saved him. The moment that had stunned the courtroom and overturned everything. People wanted to know where Max had been, how he had survived, why he had chosen that moment to return. But Alex had no answers. All he knew was that Max was back, and that, in the end, his loyalty had been stronger than the justice system's failures. In the days that followed, people across the country talked about the case. It became a symbol of truth, of perseverance, of the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. A local news station called it the trial that wasn't going anywhere until a dog solved it. Social media exploded with theories, debates, and outpourings of love for Max. Animal rights organizations reached out to feature his story. Legal experts argued over whether animals should have a place in courtrooms. Some even suggested that, in an indirect way, Max had been the most important witness of the entire trial. And in a way, they were right. For Alex, life would never be the same. He had walked into that courthouse every day, prepared for the worst. He had resigned himself to the fact that no matter how hard he fought, the truth might never be enough. But then, against all odds, the truth had found him, and it had 4 legs and a wagging tail. Now, as he stepped out of the courthouse a free man, Max trotting beside him, the world felt different, brighter, lighter, and finally, after what felt like a lifetime, it felt fair, because justice had been served, not by a lawyer's clever argument, not by a last-minute piece of forensic evidence, not even by a confession, but by a dog who refused to let his best friend be forgotten. And that was the greatest defense of all. Years later, people would still talk about Max. Law students would study the case, marveling at how a single moment had unraveled what seemed like an airtight conviction. Dog lovers would tell the story to their children, a bedtime tale of loyalty and love. And in that same city, in that same courthouse, Max's paw prints would forever be imprinted in the minds of those who had been there that day. Because in the end, Max wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected heroes walk on 4 legs. And that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to come home. If you love this story, make sure to subscribe for more incredible animal stories.